When I look back now, it still feels unreal. The way one chapter of my life ended with silence, and another began with my name plastered across the news under the headline about a $50 million company. But before all that noise, there was a time when I was completely alone, cut off by the very people who raised me, taught me to walk, and convinced me that family was something you could always fall back on. I used to believe that no matter how hard things got, my parents would always be on my side. But life has a way of testing the things you think are unbreakable. It started the night I came home early, long before my success, long before investors and TV interviews and people calling me a self-made founder. Back then, I was just a young black entrepreneur with a notebook full of wild ideas and a heart full of hope. I walked into the living room expecting the usual quiet, but instead my parents sat stiffly on the sofa, their faces cold, their eyes fixed on me like I had already done something wrong. There were no greetings, no smiles. Just this heavy silence that felt thicker than anything I had felt before. My mother was the first to speak, and her voice wasn't soft like it used to be when she tucked me into bed growing up. It was sharp, controlled, and almost trembling. She said they couldn't support what I was doing anymore. She said I was wasting my future, that I was embarrassing the family, that I was chasing dreams that didn't belong to people like us. I stood there, stunned, because the business idea I believed in was the one thing that made me feel alive. But to them it was nothing more than a reckless fantasy. My father didn't say much. He just looked at me the same way you look at a stranger you're not sure you trust. I tried to explain my vision, the product I had been building, the meetings I had lined up, the hours I spent studying, researching, planning. But every sentence I said seemed to push them further away. By the time I finished, my father simply stood up, walked to the door, and told me to leave if I wasn't willing to come back to reality. Reality. That word haunted me for months afterward. Because reality for me became a tiny rented room with peeling paint, a shaky desk, a laptop that overheated every hour, and a fridge that was usually empty. Reality became waking up before sunrise and going to sleep after midnight because I believed that somewhere inside all the struggle, my idea mattered. Reality became chasing investors who ignored me, companies who didn't take me seriously, and people who politely smiled but doubted me the second I turned around. But reality also became the feeling that even though my parents had cut me off, even though I felt abandoned and misunderstood, I had one thing that nobody could take away from me, my vision. And that vision pushed me through every lonely night, every rejection, every mistake, every moment when quitting felt easier than trying again. I wasn't building a company just to prove my parents wrong. At first, I told myself I was doing it for me, for my future. But deep down, I also wanted them to see me, really see me. I wanted them to realize that dreams weren't childish and ambition wasn't disrespect. But year after year went by and the distance between us only grew. Birthdays passed in silence. Holidays felt strange. I became used to not hearing their voices. Then, everything shifted the day an investor finally gave me 15 minutes, just 15 minutes, to explain what my product could do. I remember the way his eyebrows lifted halfway through my pitch, and the way he suddenly leaned forward, asking questions, taking notes, studying every word. That meeting changed everything. One deal led to another. Small wins turned into big opportunities. Suddenly, my company wasn't just surviving, it was exploding faster than I could keep up with. I hired my first team, then my second, then my 10th. We went from working in cramped spaces to renting out full floors. My product went from sketches to prototypes to something the entire market began talking about. People started sending emails from places I had only seen in magazines. And one morning, when I least expected it, a news channel aired a segment calling my business one of the fastest growing companies in the country. That was the exact moment my parents saw me again. Not in person. Not through a phone call. But on their TV screen. The reporter said my name clearly. The camera zoomed in on me standing beside my team. They talked about the company's valuation, $50 million. They talked about my background. They talked about how I started with nothing. And somewhere in the middle of that broadcast, my parents realized the child they once dismissed had built something bigger than any of us ever imagined. My phone began buzzing like crazy that day, but one vibration made my heart stop. It was my mother. Her name lit up my screen for the first time in years. Then my father's number appeared right after, calling just seconds apart as if they were afraid I might ignore them. I stared at my phone so long that it eventually stopped ringing on its own. I didn't pick up. I didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or shut the phone off completely. Because how do you answer a call like that? What are you supposed to say to the people who cut you off and then suddenly remembered you existed only after the world celebrated you? Do you welcome them back? Do you forgive them? Do you stay silent? Do you ask why now, after everything? I didn't know. I still don't know. Because the moment the phone stopped ringing, another call came in, one I wasn't expecting. A call that changed everything again and sent my story in a direction I could have never predicted. And that is where things truly began to get complicated. The kind of complicated that makes you question loyalty, success, and what family actually means. The kind of complicated that forces you to choose between the life you built and the people who helped shape you, even if they broke you along the way. And what happened next? Well, that's the part of the story I'm about to tell you. When the second call came in, I didn't recognize the number at all. It wasn't my parents, it wasn't any friend, and it definitely wasn't one of my business contacts. It was a number with no name, no clue behind it, just a long string of digits glowing on my screen. And for some reason, something in my gut told me I should answer it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe I just needed to hear any voice other than my own racing thoughts. So I picked up the phone and said hello, not realizing that moment would pull me deeper into the past I thought I'd left behind. The voice on the other end was calm, older, and carried a tone like he knew more about me than he should. He introduced himself as someone who had known my parents for a long time, someone who had watched me grow up from a distance, someone who claimed he had information I might want to hear. As soon as he said that, the air in the room felt heavy, like the world had suddenly slowed down. I asked who he was really, but he didn't answer the way I expected. He only said he wanted to meet in person, that it was important, and that it had something to do with why my parents had suddenly started calling after so many years. That was the moment the story stopped being just about success. It became something else, something deeper. Something connected to the years before the silence, before the arguments, before the day I packed my bags and walked out with nothing but an idea and stubborn hope. Until then, I thought the distance between me and my parents was simple. A disagreement, a clash of visions, a hard break caused by misunderstandings. But the man's voice made it feel like there was something I hadn't been told. Something that changed how everything started. I didn't agree to meet him right away. Instead, I hung up and sat in my office chair staring at the wall like it might give me answers. My team was outside discussing a new marketing strategy, but I barely heard them. My mind kept circling back to my mother's name glowing on my screen, the unanswered call, the disappointment I still carried, and now this stranger who hinted at hidden pieces of my own history. Growing up as a young black kid in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, secrets never stayed secret for long. If someone argued, the whole block heard it. If someone succeeded, the whole street celebrated. If someone failed, you heard the whispers before you even got home. But my parents, they were different. They were private in a way that never made sense to me. They went to work, came home, stayed quiet, and moved through life like they were hiding from something. I just never thought it had anything to do with me. But now I wasn't so sure. I kept replaying that final day at home in my mind, the day they cut me off. My mother's trembling voice. My father's cold silence. The way they looked at me like the decision wasn't new, like it had been waiting inside them long before I showed up with my business plans. Back then, I told myself they were afraid I'd fail, afraid I'd end up struggling like they did, afraid I'd chase dreams too big for our circumstances. But what if there was more? What if my choices had touched a nerve I didn't know existed? Those thoughts followed me everywhere for the next few days. During meetings, my mind drifted. During interviews, I found myself answering questions on autopilot. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly the man meant when he said he knew why my parents were calling me again. I didn't reach out to my parents. I didn't return their calls. I didn't block them either. I just let the distance linger, because I wasn't ready to hear anything from them until I understood the truth behind the silence. Meanwhile, the world around me kept moving fast. News outlets kept reaching out. Social media kept repeating my name. People kept calling me an overnight success, even though my night was years long, filled with struggle no one but me had witnessed. The company's value kept climbing, and investors lined up like they had always believed in me from the beginning. It was strange being celebrated when my heart felt so unsettled. In moments like that, I remembered the early days, the grind, the loneliness, the determination that pushed me forward when everything else fell apart. I remembered working at my tiny desk, building my product piece by piece. I remembered every rejection email that made me question myself, and every small breakthrough that kept me going. I remembered how many times I whispered to myself that I would make it, even when I had no proof. And for a while that memory brought me comfort. But then the unknown number called again. This time I answered on the second ring. The same man spoke, only now his voice sounded more urgent. He said he understood why I was hesitant, but he didn't have much time. He said the story behind my parents' decision wasn't something he could put on the phone. He said meeting was necessary. And then he mentioned something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He said, "Your parents didn't cut you off because of your business. They cut you off because they were afraid something from their past would reach you." My breath caught. That sentence didn't fit with anything I knew. My parents were simple people, hardworking, quiet, always serious. What past could they possibly have that would affect me? What could they be scared of? And why did it matter now, years later, at the peak of my success? The man didn't clarify. He only repeated the request to meet. And before I could ask anything else, the call ended again. That night, I found myself staring at an old photo on my phone, me at 8 years old, standing between my parents at a neighborhood cookout. They were smiling in that picture like everything was normal, like the world was safe. But looking at it now, with all the confusion and unanswered questions, I felt like I didn't know either of them as well as I once believed. Suspense built in my stomach, almost as if there was a story buried under my own life, a story waiting to surface whether I was ready or not. I knew the truth could change the way I saw everything. My childhood, my success, the years of silence, and even the sudden attention my parents were giving me now. But part of me also wondered something else, something quieter, more painful. Were they calling because they missed me? Or were they calling because they needed something? That question stayed with me, gripping me stronger each day. I kept working, kept leading my team, kept building the company, but the tension never left. It grew. It spread. It wrapped itself around every thought I had, pushing me closer to a choice I wasn't sure how to make. And when the man called a third time, with a tremor in his voice I hadn't heard before, he finally said something that pushed everything over the edge. He told me my parents weren't just trying to reconnect. He said they were running out of time. And the real reason they cut me off was something they had never wanted me to discover. But I was about to. When he said my parents were running out of time, the words didn't feel dramatic. They felt honest. Too honest. Honest enough that I couldn't shake them off the way I tried to brush off everything else. That night, long after my team left the office and the building grew quiet, I sat alone, staring at the city lights through the window, wondering what exactly I didn't know about the people who raised me. I wanted to pretend the tension didn't matter, to focus on business deals, new clients, and the nonstop pressure of running a $50 million company. But every time my phone lit up, whether it was an investor or a friend, I found myself hoping it was the unknown number again, or maybe even my parents. It's strange how success can amplify personal silence instead of covering it. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man's voice and the way he said they were afraid something from their past would reach me. Past? What past? My parents lived carefully. They avoided trouble. They minded their business. But maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe the quietness wasn't normal. Maybe it was a shield. Maybe I just never questioned it because kids rarely question the world they grow up in. And then another thought kept creeping up on me. If their past was really that serious, why hide it from me? Why not warn me? Why cut me off when I needed them most? What kind of secret makes a parent walk away from their own child? I didn't have answers, but the questions dug deeper than anything else. The next day at work, I tried to act normal. My assistant walked into my office with a thick folder filled with documents about a new expansion project. I nodded along, pretended to read, pretended to focus, but I kept thinking about my mother's voice on the unanswered call, how it trembled, how she sounded like she was choosing her words carefully. I remembered my father's missed call too, how I stared at his name without pressing accept, feeling anger and hesitation mix into something complicated. My assistant noticed something was off. She asked if everything was okay and I forced a smile, saying I was just tired. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She left, and the office door closed softly behind her, leaving me buried in my own thoughts again. Meanwhile, online articles kept spreading. People kept praising my story. Some even called me an inspiration, a young black entrepreneur who proved anything is possible. But the irony of that praise made me feel strange, because while everyone else believed I had everything figured out, I was more confused than ever. It felt like two different worlds, the world where I was thriving publicly and the world where my personal life was falling apart privately. Later that afternoon, I finally texted the stranger who kept calling. I didn't agree to meet, not yet. I only wrote, "What do you mean they're running out of time?" He didn't respond. Not immediately, anyway. Instead, another subplot in my life started pulling at me, something I hadn't noticed because I was too wrapped up in the mystery of my parents. One of my lead developers, someone who'd been loyal since the early days, asked for a private meeting. His voice sounded tense, his message short. When we sat down, he seemed worried, almost nervous as he showed me a report about odd activity inside our company servers. Someone was trying to access files that weren't supposed to be touched. Files that contained early drafts of our product, financial records, partnership agreements. At first, I thought it was normal cybersecurity noise. Big companies attract digital trouble like heat attracts flies. But then he said the attempts came from someone who used old information only people from my early team would know. That's when something inside me tightened. I wondered if someone from my past had suddenly regained interest in what I'd built. A jealous ex-teammate, maybe? Or a former investor? Or worse, someone connected to the story the stranger hinted at. But it didn't end there. That same week, a journalist reached out to my PR manager asking if I'd comment on rumors connected to my family. My PR manager dismissed it, thinking it was just gossip or someone trying to stir drama now that my name was circulating everywhere. But when she told me, I froze. Rumors about what? How did anyone even know anything personal about my family when we barely existed publicly as a unit? What exactly were people digging for? It became obvious something bigger was moving around me, something I didn't invite and definitely didn't understand. My professional life and personal life were quietly intertwining in ways I didn't anticipate. That night, as I finally left the office, the street outside felt colder than usual. I walked toward my car and before I even reached it, my phone buzzed again. It was the same unknown number. I answered right away this time. The man breathed heavily as if he'd rushed to call. He said he received my text and wanted to explain, but someone had contacted him earlier that day, asking questions about my parents. He didn't know who it was, but he sounded shaken. He told me the situation was becoming more urgent than he expected. He said he wasn't sure how much longer he could stay involved. I asked again what he meant about them running out of time. And this time he gave a little more. He said my parents once made a choice, one that protected me but cost them something they never recovered from. He said the choice had consequences that were starting to surface now that my name was in the spotlight. He said the attention from my business success might have triggered something or someone from the past to start looking again. I felt a chill run through me. I wanted to ask 1,000 things. What choice? Who is looking for them? Why now? But he cut me off. He told me he needed to be careful with what he shared. And before he hung up, he said something that hit deeper than anything else. He said, your parents didn't want you to rise in silence. They wanted you to rise safely. But safety is the part slipping away now. My fingers tightened around the phone. The streetlights flickered above me and for a moment, everything around me felt unreal. I thought success would bring freedom, pride, maybe healing. I never imagined it would bring danger or secrets or strangers warning me about things I wasn't prepared for. I sat in my car for a long time, replaying his words, wondering what truth could be so serious that it echoed through every quiet moment of my childhood. I thought about my parents, their strict rules, their constant fear of attention, their private habits, their distant behavior. Maybe everything I once misunderstood was actually part of a bigger story, one they never wanted me to be part of. But whether I was ready or not, I was part of it now. The unanswered calls from my parents. The man's warnings. The attempts to access our company files. The journalist digging into my family. The strange urgency building around me. It all pointed to one thing. The past wasn't just coming back. It was already here. And whatever my parents had tried to escape, it was finally catching up. I drove home that night with the city lights blurring past the windows, but none of it registered. My mind kept circling the same questions, looping through them like a song I couldn't turn off. I kept thinking about my parents' tight expressions the day they cut me off, the stranger's warnings, and the sudden attention around my business. Every element felt connected, yet nothing made enough sense to calm me. The deeper I went into my own thoughts, the clearer it became that things weren't just happening to me, they were happening around me like I had stepped into a story that began long before I was born. When I reached my apartment, I didn't even turn the lights on. I sat in the dark, phone in hand, watching the screen glow with notifications. Emails, investor updates, missed messages. But I wasn't looking for any of that. I kept hoping the unknown number would call again, even though part of me dreaded what else he might say. My silence felt heavy, like the world had paused for me alone. Around midnight my phone buzzed, but this time it wasn't him. It was a text from my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to since before I started my company. She wrote that she saw my parents leaving our old neighborhood earlier that evening, looking stressed, and she asked if everything was okay. My chest tightened. My parents rarely left the house unless they had to. They were creatures of habit, protective of routine. Them being out late in public and looking stressed wasn't something small. I typed back asking if she knew where they were going, but she didn't respond. Seeing her message only added another layer to the tension already building inside me. It felt like the people closest to my past were suddenly moving in ways they never had before, and I kept wondering if I had triggered something by simply succeeding. As the night dragged on, another subplot began unfolding quietly in the background. A colleague from my legal team called unexpectedly, her voice low and careful. She told me that someone had been making inquiries, not just about me but about the company's early contracts. She said the questions were vague but persistent, and the person asking claimed to be researching past associations tied to my name. When she pressed for details, the caller hung up. That phrase, past associations, made every warning from the stranger echo louder in my head. What associations? What past? My parents never mentioned anything unusual. Their lives were simple, almost too simple. They worked, saved money, avoided drama, and did everything they could to keep me focused and safe. But the more I thought about it, the more their strict boundaries felt less like discipline and more like fear. Fear of attention. Fear of trouble. Fear of being seen. The next morning as I walked into the office, I noticed something off with my staff. People whispered to each other, glancing my way before pretending to look busy. My assistant finally approached me with a hesitant expression and said a reporter had been waiting outside the building earlier, asking questions about my childhood. That caught me off guard. My childhood wasn't something I talked about publicly, not because I was hiding anything, but because I thought there wasn't much to say. Now, apparently, someone believed there was. The tension around me grew in ways I couldn't control. Even inside the company where I usually felt confident and grounded, I sensed unease. My team tried to focus on meetings, deadlines, and new partnerships, but I could tell they noticed my distraction. One of my managers quietly asked if I needed a break or time off. I told him I was fine even though I wasn't. I couldn't take a break, not with unanswered questions circling me like shadows. Later that afternoon, the unknown number called again, but I missed it while I was in a meeting. When I called back, it went straight to voicemail. And for the first time, I felt something close to urgency, like I needed answers fast, like something was shifting behind the scenes, something I didn't have the tools to handle alone. Desperate for clarity, I finally did something I hadn't done in years. I drove back to my parents' neighborhood. Even though so much of my life had changed, that old street felt frozen in time. The same cracked sidewalk. The same rusted fence. The same quiet houses with curtains drawn every evening. But when I pulled up in front of my childhood home, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. The lights were off. The car wasn't in the driveway. The house looked closed, like it had been empty for days. I stepped out and knocked anyway. Nothing. I knocked again. Still nothing. A neighbor stepped outside, someone who knew my parents well. When she saw me, her eyebrows lifted like she had been expecting me. She told me my parents had left earlier that day with 2 large bags. She said they looked rushed, almost scared. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. Then she hesitated, lowered her voice, and added something that made my stomach twist. She said a man had come by their house earlier that week asking questions about me. She didn't know who he was, only that he wasn't from the neighborhood, and he carried himself like someone who wasn't just passing through. She said my parents didn't answer the door, but she saw them peeking from behind the curtain as the man stood outside for almost 15 minutes. When she told me that, a strange chill passed through me. Was this the same person trying to access my company files? Or the same person contacting journalists? Or someone entirely different? Another part of the story I hadn't uncovered yet? I thanked her and walked back to my car feeling more lost than when I arrived. The street suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a place filled with memories I no longer trusted. I kept replaying her words, imagining my parents inside the house, scared of someone knocking at their door. When I got home again, I found a voicemail waiting from the unknown number. The man didn't speak for the first few seconds, as if he was gathering himself. Then he said he knew my parents had left the neighborhood. He said he couldn't explain everything yet, but he wanted me to be careful. Careful about what I said publicly, careful about where I went, careful about who contacted me. He ended with something that wasn't a threat, but it felt like a warning wrapped in concern. He said, "The past is more complicated than you think. And the people looking for answers, they won't stop just because you're successful." The voicemail ended abruptly, leaving a hollow silence. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt since the early, struggling days of my startup. Fear. Not fear of failing. Not fear of rejection. But fear of truth. Fear of what I would find if I kept digging. Fear of what I would uncover about my parents and myself. I knew I had to keep going. I knew I had to find out the truth even if it hurt. But I also knew something else, something I couldn't shake. I wasn't just being pulled into the past. I was being pulled into something bigger than family issues, bigger than secrets, bigger than success. Something that had been waiting for years. Waiting for me. I replayed the voicemail over and over, listening for anything I might have missed. A background sound, a shaky breath, anything that could explain why the man sounded more tense than before. But every time it ended, I was left in the same uneasy silence. I knew something had changed. Something bigger had shifted behind the scenes, and I felt it pressing against my life like a weight I wasn't prepared for. The past wasn't just catching up anymore, it was gaining on me. Over the next couple of days, I tried to work like nothing was happening. Meetings, emails, planning sessions, all of it moved around me like a blur. My team could tell I wasn't myself, but no one said anything. People respected my space because they trusted me, something I had built from years of grinding, sacrificing, and building this company from scratch. But trust is scary when you feel like the ground beneath you is shaking. Then everything escalated. On a Thursday morning as I walked into the office, security stopped me before I reached the elevator. They said someone had tried entering the building the night before. Someone who wasn't on the visitor log and didn't have clearance. The person didn't break in, didn't force anything, didn't leave any damage. But the cameras caught them standing in the lobby for nearly 10 minutes, just staring at the wall where our company achievements and photos were displayed. The part that made my stomach drop was what security said next. The cameras showed the person staring at my photo. Just staring. No movement. No attempt to hide their face. Like they wanted someone to know they had been there. When they showed me the footage, my heart froze. The man in the footage was the same build as the stranger who had come to my parents' house in my old neighborhood. He wasn't someone I recognized personally, but seeing the way he stood calmly like he had all the time in the world, that terrified me more than anything. And then the second twist hit, the one I never expected. Later that afternoon, my assistant rushed into my office with her phone in hand, her expression pale. She said there had been a package delivered, not to the reception desk, not through the company mail, but directly to my private office door. No sender. No label. Nothing. Just a small, flat envelope taped to the floor. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. My parents standing outside a bus terminal 3 days earlier. Looking over their shoulders. Holding those same large bags the neighbor mentioned. They looked anxious, more anxious than I'd ever seen them. Someone had taken the photo without them knowing. Someone had been following them. My hands shook as I held the picture. I hadn't heard from my parents since the night they tried calling me. I didn't know where they were, who they were with, or if they were safe. And now this, someone dropping surveillance photos straight into my office like a message. My assistant asked if she should call the police, but I told her no. Not yet. My gut kept telling me this situation wasn't something the police could simply fix. It felt bigger, like a knot that had been tightening for years and was finally reaching its breaking point. That night, after the office emptied, I sat alone thinking about the man who kept calling me. I wondered if he had sent the photo or if someone else was playing a different game. I wondered if my parents were hiding from the same person watching me. And then a question hit me that I didn't want to think about. Were my parents running from danger? Or running from someone they once knew? The next morning, the unknown number called again, but this time the man didn't sound like himself. His voice was rushed, uneven, almost whispering. He said he didn't have much time. He said things were moving faster than expected. He said my parents were in the middle of something they tried to avoid for 20 years. I could hear cars in the background like he was outside somewhere. Then he said something that made everything twist into a new shape. He said, "You were never supposed to get involved. They tried to protect you. But someone found out who you are, who you've become." I asked him if he was the one who left the photo. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said there were people who believed my success made me visible, and visibility makes old stories resurface. Old stories. That phrase sent another wave of confusion through me. Before I could ask more, he said something that became the second twist, the one that changed everything I thought I knew. He said, "Your parents didn't leave their old life behind. They only paused it. And now the people they once walked away from, they want answers." My breath caught. I didn't know what old life he meant. My parents worked regular jobs. They weren't involved in anything unusual. They lived quietly. They barely had friends. They were careful, almost too careful. But I never thought it meant they were hiding something. He tried to keep talking, but suddenly he stopped mid-sentence. His voice shifted, sharper, lower. He said, "I can't stay on the phone. Someone's watching me." The line cut. I stared at my phone, pulse racing. Someone was watching him now. How big was this? How far did it reach? How were my parents connected to any of it? I didn't know where to turn. My life was supposed to be about my company, innovation, growth, things I could control with hard work and strategy. But this felt like stepping into a storm I didn't see coming. I couldn't focus the rest of the day. I kept pacing my office, checking my phone, replaying the voicemail, studying the photo again and again. I tried calling my parents, but their numbers went straight to voicemail. I tried messaging them. Nothing. Just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, my legal team forwarded an email that stopped me cold. A reporter had reached out claiming they had documents connected to my family's past. Documents they wanted my comment on before publishing a feature. The email didn't attach anything, but the tone was confident. Almost threatening. They said, "We believe these details explain certain choices made in your upbringing." I felt cold all over. Not choices I made. Choices they made. And then, as if the universe wasn't done escalating things, I received another message, this time from a private number. It wasn't the unknown man. It wasn't a journalist. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The message only said, "We finally know where to find you." Just that. 8 words. No explanation. No name. And in that moment I understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever my parents had been running from, whatever they tried to shield me from, whatever past they hoped would stay buried, it wasn't just resurfacing. It was coming straight for me. And it wasn't slowing down. I felt my stomach drop as the email from the investor scrolled across the screen. The man who had backed my company from the beginning, the one who had always kept a careful distance, suddenly sounded urgent, almost panicked. He wanted an immediate meeting. No explanations. No details. Just a request that felt more like a command. And at the same time, my parents kept calling nonstop, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each one more frantic than the last. I didn't know which fire needed putting out first, and the pressure kept building like the walls were closing in. For a moment I just stood there in the middle of my office, trying to breathe through the uneasiness rising in my chest. Everything around me felt too quiet, too still. The soft hum of computers, the glow of screens, the soft chatter in distant corners of the building, all of it felt far away, like I was listening from underwater. I knew something was coming. Something big. And for the first time in years, I didn't know if I was ready for whatever this next twist was bringing. I finally stepped inside the conference room, and the investor was already waiting on a video call, his expression tight. He didn't greet me the way he usually did. There was no small talk. No warm tone. Just a single deep breath and the words I wasn't prepared to hear. "I think someone close to you is trying to sabotage everything you built." The room stopped. My heartbeat slowed, then sped up until it felt like it might burst in my ears. I asked him to repeat it, hoping I had misheard, but he didn't back down. He leaned closer to the camera, eyes sharp, as if he had been holding this information back for too long. He explained that a series of reports, all filled with false numbers and twisted details, had been sent anonymously to several media outlets. They attacked the company's credibility, claimed the growth was fake, and even suggested illegal activity, things so far from the truth it was laughable, yet dangerous enough to spark an investigation. He managed to intercept most of them, but not all. And he believed whoever sent them had access to information only someone who knew me personally would have. When he said that, my chest tightened. My mind ran through names like a deck of cards being shuffled too fast to read. Employees? No. Friends? Maybe, but unlikely. Family? I didn't want to even think that far, but the possibility crept in, unwelcome and cold. The investor paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he said he had a reason to believe the person responsible had recently tried to reach out to me. That hit me like a slap. The timing lined up too neatly, my parents calling nonstop right after the story broke, then right after the suspicious emails were discovered. But I refused to jump to conclusions, even though the fear sat heavy in my throat. Before I could ask more questions, another call buzzed through. I ignored it. But then another. And another. Each one from an unknown number. I shouldn't have answered, but something told me to pick up. When I did, the voice on the other end was shaking, not with anger but fear. It was my cousin Daniel. He hadn't called me in years, not since the day my parents cut me off and the rest of the family quietly distanced themselves too. His voice cracked as he whispered that he needed to tell me something urgently. He kept saying he didn't want to be involved, that he had tried to stay out of it, but things had gone too far. The more he talked, the more I realized he was terrified. But before he could explain anything clearly, I heard the muffled sound of someone yelling in the background, followed by a loud crash. Daniel's breathing changed, quick and uneven. He lowered his voice even more, whispering rapidly like he was afraid someone might hear him. "They're watching me," he said. "They don't want you to know the truth. And your parents, they're not calling you for the reason you think." My whole body tensed. I asked him what he meant, but he cut himself off again, panicked. He begged me to meet him somewhere safe, somewhere private. He gave me a location, one that made no sense to me, an empty parking lot behind an old shopping plaza we used to visit as kids. Then the line suddenly went dead, leaving only a hollow ringing in my ear. I stood there for a long moment, phone still pressed to my ear, the emptiness of the disconnected call echoing in my mind. Daniel sounded genuinely afraid. And if he was scared, then something serious was happening, something bigger than just some angry investors or jealous competitors. But the thought that kept circling around and around in my mind was the one I didn't want to accept. What if my parents weren't calling to make peace? What if they weren't calling because they were proud of what I'd built? What if they were connected to whatever Daniel was trying to warn me about? I pushed the thought away, but it stayed there, sitting heavy like a stone. As if the day wasn't chaotic enough, I walked out into the hallway only to find my assistant with a worried look on her face. She told me a group of reporters had gathered outside the building, some of them holding printed versions of those same reports the investor had warned me about. They were shouting questions, demanding answers, asking if the rumors were true. The tension felt thick, suffocating, and I could feel the eyes of my own employees quietly observing, wondering what was going on. I felt my pulse racing as I made my way back to my office, trying to think through everything logically. The sabotage, the anonymous reports, my investor's warning, my cousin's panic, my parents' sudden interest after years of silence. All of it tangled together in a way that didn't feel accidental. Then another message popped up on my phone, this time a voice note from my mother. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. Her voice spilled through the speaker, but it wasn't the soft, loving voice I remembered from childhood. It was tight, strained, almost desperate. She said they needed to see me immediately. That it was a matter of family safety. She said there were things I didn't understand, things they had kept from me for my own good. And then she said something that made my knees weaken slightly. We shouldn't have cut you off. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I replayed those words over and over. What wasn't supposed to happen like that? Why now, after all these years of silence and judgment? Why suddenly talk about family safety? What were they hiding all this time? With every question stacking on top of the next, I realized the stakes weren't just high, they were getting higher by the hour. And as I stood there holding my phone, heart pounding, unsure of who to trust or what truth was waiting for me, I knew one thing for certain. The real story was only just beginning. I drove toward the old shopping plaza with a mix of fear and determination twisting in my stomach. The sky was already fading into evening, the kind of soft, dim light that made everything look more dramatic than it needed to be. But maybe that was fitting because nothing about the last few days had been simple or calm. Every turn of the wheel felt heavier, like I was crossing into a part of my life I had been avoiding for years. Yet deep down, I knew this was the moment that would finally bring everything to the surface. Every secret, every misunderstanding, every buried truth that had been shaping my life without my knowledge. When I finally pulled into the empty parking lot, it was quiet except for the faint hum of streetlights. I saw Daniel sitting in his car, shoulders hunched, head lowered. He looked smaller somehow, like life had been squeezing him from all directions. When he stepped out, his hands were shaking, and he kept glancing around as if expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. He didn't waste time. He told me everything in one long breath, like a confession he had been forced to keep for too long. He explained that the anonymous reports sent to the media weren't random attacks. They were part of a scheme created by a distant relative who had been trying to take control of an old family trust. Something that had been set up decades ago, long before I was even born. Something I had never been told about because my parents believed it was better to keep family business quiet. That trust, according to Daniel, had been losing value for years. And when my company skyrocketed to success, suddenly my name, and my money, became the center of their plans. They wanted leverage. They wanted access. And someone thought damaging my company would force me to come back home and become part of the family decisions, the way they phrased it behind closed doors. The realization hit me hard. They hadn't cut me off because they hated me or disapproved of my choices. They cut me off because they were desperate, scared, and trying to protect something they didn't even fully understand. They thought pushing me away would keep me from being dragged into the conflict. But the plan twisted into something darker once the wrong person got involved. Someone who saw opportunity in chaos. When Daniel finished talking, he looked exhausted, like the truth had been weighing him down for too long. He admitted he shouldn't have stayed silent, but fear had kept him trapped. He apologized, not in the dramatic way people do in movies, but in a quiet, shaking voice that told me he truly meant it. I didn't respond right away. I just let the words settle, trying to absorb all the layers of what he had told me. Before I could even fully react, two headlights appeared from the far side of the lot. My chest tightened as a familiar car approached. It was my parents. They stepped out slowly, almost nervously, as if unsure how I would respond. My mother's eyes were already watery, and my father stood stiff, like he had rehearsed what he wanted to say but still didn't know where to begin. For a moment we all just stood there, staring at each other, surrounded by years of silence and hurt. My mother was the first to speak. Her voice cracked when she admitted they had made a terrible mistake. They thought cutting me off would force me to find myself, the way they believed I needed to. They thought distance would push me to stop chasing what they considered unrealistic dreams. And when my company became successful, they didn't know how to approach me without feeling ashamed of their choices. My father swallowed hard before adding that they didn't know about the family trust problems until it was too late. By the time they realized someone was using my success as leverage, the damage had already started. They tried to reach out, but they were afraid I wouldn't listen. And once the news story hit, that fear turned into panic. Hearing all of this felt like peeling back layers of misunderstandings that had been sitting between us for years. It didn't excuse everything, but it made the picture clearer. It made the anger less sharp, the pain a little softer. I finally saw them not as the strict, distant parents I had built up in my head, but as people who made flawed choices while trying to navigate complicated situations. We ended up talking for hours, real, honest talking. My parents apologized more than once, not trying to justify their actions, just acknowledging the harm they had caused. And for the first time in a long time, my father told me he was proud of what I built. Proud of the $50 million company, proud of my resilience, proud that I didn't crumble even when everything around me seemed to fall apart. I didn't forgive everything instantly. No one does. Wounds that deep don't just disappear with a few words. But that night was the first time I felt like healing was possible. Like maybe the distance between us wasn't permanent. As for the person behind the sabotage, the investor stepped in with his legal team. With the evidence Daniel provided and the messages that had been intercepted, everything was handled quietly and professionally. The authorities took it from there, and I didn't need to get involved beyond providing statements. My company remained strong, my credibility intact, and the attempted damage became part of the story I fought to protect. In the weeks that followed, things slowly shifted. My parents began calling, not out of fear or panic, but out of genuine interest. We rebuilt our relationship piece by piece, learning how to talk again. No pressure. No expectations. Just effort. Daniel eventually told the rest of the family the truth, and while not everyone reacted gracefully, enough people did to make a difference. The toxic patterns that had silently guided the family for years finally started to break. And somewhere in the middle of all the chaos, I realized something important. Success didn't fix everything, but it gave me the strength to face things I once ran from. It gave me the confidence to stand up for myself not only in business, but in the relationships that shaped me. The story didn't end with a perfect family. It ended with an honest one. A repaired one. And that felt more meaningful than any headline or viral video. Looking back now, the experience taught me that sometimes the people who hurt you aren't trying to be villains. They're just lost, scared, or overwhelmed by their own mistakes. And while forgiveness isn't always guaranteed, understanding can create a bridge where silence once lived. In the end, my journey wasn't just about building a $50 million company. It was about rebuilding the parts of myself I thought I had lost. And maybe, without realizing it, it was also about helping my family rebuild too. And that was the real victory.